My name is Jocelyn Potts, and I am the School and Community Specialist with the Office of Equity and Accelerated Student Achievement with Anne Arundel County Public Schools. Today, we will be discussing the connection between issues of equity and stress in students. So, what is stress? Stress is something that we've heard of, that more than likely we have experienced. So, stress is how the brain and the body respond to any type of demand, any type of challenge that is being faced, whether it is performance at school, performance at work, whether it's some type of significant life change, or it could also be a traumatic event. All of those can be stressful, and the way that our body and our brain respond to that develop is stress. So stress occurs in response to frightening or threatening events, or it can respond to certain conditions that we are faced with. Stress can impede a child's behavior, their cognitive capacity, and their emotional and physical health. According to the Equity Policy Institute, frightening or threatening situations are more sustained and are experienced more frequently by students of color and other marginalized student groups. So today we're going to discuss how we can mitigate children's stress to tolerable levels, because we are aware that we all experience stress and not all stress is bad. Depending on how we respond to it, how we're able to process it, may not all be bad. But if it's for prolonged periods of time and our response to it is not appropriate for the situation, we can have serious impacts with our health because of that. So let's talk about some stress in children and what some of the signs and symptoms could possibly be. Well, we might see changes in a student's eating habits. We might also see some changes in sleeping patterns. Fearful reactions where there might not have otherwise been any could also be a possible sign that a student is experiencing stress. Activity withdrawal, so not wanting to participate in certain events or hobbies or social gatherings or events, might be a sign of stress as well. A decline in grades is a possibility. A sense of hopelessness and feeling like things just won't get better. Also, a decline in school attendance are all possible signs and symptoms of stress, but there are many, many more on top of the ones that we just listed. So we talked about some causes of stress, right? Traumatic experiences, life changes, fear, frightening events, certain conditions. But inequity also causes stress in students. So how does inequity show up for children? It may show up directly or it may show up indirectly. And sometimes students are able to recognize it, but sometimes they're not able to. And that will really depend on their exposure. It might also depend on their age or their grade level, whether or not they recognize these inequities that they're being faced with or not. So we're talking a lot about inequity. Well, what is inequity? And simply put, inequity is a lack of justice. So a lack of justice that may be displayed in various settings or circumstances is an inequity. And let's further talk about that. So why is that important? And let's really hone it into where we are here in Anne Arundel County. So in November of 2019, the Anne Arundel County Executive and Health Officer declared racism a public health issue. Now that's major. But how does racism show up? How does it show up? How does it look in situations of inequity? And then how does that relate to stress? Well, racism can show up in healthcare, in our education system. It can show up in economic stability, nutrition, housing, transportation, so many different areas of our lives. Racism can show up. And then we are faced with these inequities and lack of access to certain things. But these are big topics, and students may not recognize them. They may not be familiar with them, and that's okay. But what they may recognize is poverty, if they're experiencing that or know someone that is experiencing that. Students might also recognize discrimination. They may recognize grading policies that are not fair or that may be biased. Students may also recognize unfair discipline policies. So that goes back to that lack of justice and that lack of fairness. Students may recognize that they are being treated older than they actually are, which is called adultification. Depending on the age of students, again, they may recognize that there is a biased curriculum where they're not seeing themselves in the curriculum represented honorably, truthfully, or factually. They may also recognize in the curriculum that they're not seeing glimpses into other people's lives, other people's experiences and perspectives in a way that is also honoring. Students may recognize that they are not feeling seen or heard by adults in authority, and that can happen in any type of situation or setting. So, again, although students may not recognize that racism can show up in education or that racism can show up in our nutrition or in our housing, they may recognize these smaller factors that are symptoms of. So let's talk about health equity and the social determinants of health. So this goes along with what we just talked about. So social determinants of health, economic stability. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about debt. We're talking about our income. We're talking about our medical bills, the expenses that we pay out. Also, neighborhood and physical environment. So that includes our housing, that includes our transportation, that includes the safety of our neighborhoods. That includes playgrounds and parks for children to play in and to be in. What do they look like? How do they have access? And what is the condition of those parks and those playgrounds? What does the walkability look like in the environment that children are being brought up in? Are there sidewalks that are clear and safe? Are there stop signs? Are there traffic signals to help keep children safe as they are walking in their neighborhood? Well, education is a big one. When we talk about education, that might look at higher education and what's the access to higher education, affordability, admissions requirements, etc. Literacy, language. Are students able to access the education that is presented before them? Are they able to access it due to language? Early childhood education. We know that exposure to early childhood education mitigates many of the hardships that students face if they are not exposed to early childhood education. Food. So we talked about nutrition a little bit. Are students being brought up in a food desert? Is there access to multiple grocery stores? Do those grocery stores have fresh, affordable produce and other fresh foods? Is there access to healthy options? Next is community and social context. So when we're talking about that, we're talking about community engagement. What does that look like? We're talking about discrimination, the support systems that are within a community. And then we have our healthcare system. Well, what does healthcare coverage look like? Is it adequate? Is it accessible? What does provider availability look like? The quality of care that students are receiving from their providers. Provider linguistic and cultural competency. That's important. Is your provider competent culturally to manage your child's health needs? All of these social determinants of health lead to health outcomes, and they impact our mortality, our morbidity, our life expectancy, our healthcare expenditures, our health status, and functional limitations. So next, let's take a look at this data chart from the Economic Policy Institute. This data chart looks at low income and African American children and talks about how they're more likely to have stressful childhoods. So this data represents a share of kindergartners exposed to frightening or threatening childhood experiences by family, income, and by race. So across the top here, we have the number of threatening experiences from 0 to 3 or greater. And the first section talks about the family income. So families that are making greater than $20,000 per year versus families that are making less than $20,000 per year. And you'll see the what the data shows us here based on that income. So for an example, we have students that their families are making more than $20,000 have about 10% of 3 or greater frightening or threatening experiences, whereas students that their families are making less than $20,000, that percentage goes up to 17% versus 10%. So that just gives you an idea of the impact that race and income plays when it comes to stressful childhoods. Down at the bottom, it's broken down by race, specifically white and Black. And if you look at the numbers here, 52% of white students, there are zero childhood frightening or threatening experiences that were faced versus 36% of Black students in kindergarten faced zero threatening or frightening childhood experiences. So take a minute to look at that data and really be thinking about it so that we can then unpack this data. This data chart talks about children with more stressful life experiences having greater likelihood of suffering from health problems. So the ratio of share of children with 3 or more frightening or threatening childhood experiences to the share of children with no such experiences who have the condition. So with this data chart, we're talking about teen pregnancy and viral infections, eczema. We're looking at obesity in children, acute respiratory infections, ear infections. And this data also comes from the Economic Policy Institute. So take a moment to look at this data. What is it telling us? What do we see? What do we notice? So what does the science tell us? Well, according to the Center on the Developing Child at Harvard University, a poorly controlled response to stress can be damaging to health and well-being if activated for too often or too long. So again, it goes back to us talking about we all deal with stress. Stress can be healthy, stress can be normal, but if it is activated for too long or too often, then we have negative implications. So frequent or sustained activation of brain systems that respond to stress can lead to heightened vulnerability to a range of behavioral and physiological disorders over a lifetime. These undesirable outcomes can include a number of stress-related disorders affecting both mental health, so depression and anxiety, and physical health, diabetes, stroke, cardiovascular disease. So now we've talked about what the science tells us. We looked at some data that shows us how inequities disproportionately impact African American students and children. But what can we do about it? What are some strategies that we can implement that will mitigate the stress in our children, but also empower them at the same time? So here are some strategies here that I want to go over with you and really talk about. Talking about it, right? Talking about what is bothering us, talking about the inequities that we may be experiencing, helping our students to identify that and put voice and put vocabulary to the inequities that they are experiencing. It's setting up an environment where students feel free, where they feel comfortable to come to us and talk about what they're experiencing, how they're responding to it, what they're feeling in their mind, what their emotions are feeling, what is going on in their body. But realizing also that if we are experiencing our own stress, that we may not be able to help our students in that moment. And if we can, great. But if not, recognizing that it is okay to have them talk about it with a professional. So important. Empowering our students to give voice to what they're experiencing is huge. But also, we can build a village for our child. So if we already have a village surrounding our child, really strengthening that and being intentional about it. And if we don't already have one, that's okay. But really doing what we can to implement one, realizing that the old proverb tells us that it takes a village to raise a child. So, what does that look like? And how can we foster that for our students? How could that be empowering? Well, having our students realize that I have all of these loving, trusting, caring adults that are around me that want nothing more than to love on me, nurture me, and see me succeed. So even if your student is not comfortable with coming to you and talking to you about some of the things that they may be experiencing, having that village, that support around them, where you know and they know that there are other adults that they can also go to that want the best for them and that can help them navigate through these situations. But not only just adults, it's important that our students have a village of peers around them. These peers may be experiencing the same type of situations that our students are. And that's important as well, that they can connect, that they can bond, that they can strategize together. And it's really empowering because students then realize I'm not alone in what I'm dealing with. I'm not alone in what I'm facing. I'm not alone in what I'm experiencing, even though I can't quite put words to what it is that I'm experiencing. And even better, affinity groups. So when students are dealing and faced with inequities, having an affinity group, a group around them that is sharing a common bond, a common thread, either that looks like them, right, that shares the same cultural norms and values and traditions as them, is really empowering because it builds a sense of self. So, in addition to talking about it with our parents, our loved ones, our guardians, extended family, our larger community, we also know that we can talk about it to a professional. In addition to talking about it, we know that we can build a village to help empower our students and also help them mitigate some of that stress that they're dealing with. But then also music. Music is so healing to most people, regardless, and it really transcends culture and race and class. But how can music mitigate stress and empower them? Well, one of the things that we can do is we can create family music date nights. And one of the things that I like to do is if there are access to smartphones or iPads or even an Alexa in the house or however it is that you listen to music, it could even be using pencil and paper. Switch phones, switch devices, create playlists for each other, but also teach your child to create playlists for themselves, depending on what it is that they're going through. Give them the power and the autonomy to name that playlist and call it whatever it is that they want. So, for example, I've created a playlist for my son, and that playlist is called Love Mommy. So, when my son is experiencing certain things, maybe some loneliness, maybe he's feeling a little bit of stress and I'm not with him at that moment, but he feels like he needs to talk to me, he can listen to this playlist, and the songs that are on this playlist speak to the messages and the positivity that I want to transfer to him in whatever situation he is going through. So giving your students the space, the time, the autonomy to create playlists, it helps them to build identity. It helps them to feel empowered, and it helps them to express what they are feeling through music. It's a great family activity. It's a great individual activity. Journaling or positive affirmations. Giving your child the experience of journaling on an index card, on a piece of paper, in a notebook, whatever it is that you have available, it can even be done electronically. Providing a journaling opportunity Some can be open-ended, where you just say, here's 10 minutes, write whatever's on your heart. I don't even have to read it, or you can share it with me if you feel comfortable. Other times you may want to give them a prompt. Today, the thing that angered me the most was, and let them fill in the blank. Positive affirmations as well are so empowering. Providing positive affirmations to your students, again, builds self-confidence, self-worth, identity. You can begin by providing these positive affirmations to your students, and eventually they will begin to generalize some of those affirmations and internalize them to where they'll be able to take over and create positive affirmations for themselves. On mirrors, on doors, using post-it notes, what positive affirmations do your children, do your students need to hear from you? What positive affirmations do they need to speak into themselves? So that when they're in school or when they're at the playground or when they're in certain situations and environments, they can recall those positive affirmations that will help them navigate through the stress in their lives at that moment. Another suggestion with positive affirmations, many times throughout the year, for example, Valentine's Day, I'll go to the dollar store, get the paper hearts, and I'll write different affirmations and I'll stick them up on my son's bedroom door. And he really takes the time. Each day he takes the time to go through and read each one. I have him read them out loud to himself over and over again, so that that affirmation is internalized. Practice using emotion language. So that could be drawing or printing off a chart that has the different emotions so that you're helping your students to identify the emotions that they are feeling. Am I angry? Am I upset? I'm hurting right now. Whatever different emotions, give them voice, give them the vocabulary to be able to name it. Call it out for what it is, name it so that then you all can process it. Advocacy skills. I'm a huge proponent of advocacy skills. And one of the ways that I suggest doing this with students to help them mitigate stress and to empower them is by role playing. Role play with students how to advocate for themselves. If they are being faced with an inequity, if someone is being biased or discriminatory toward them, or if they just see something that doesn't quite feel right to them, are they comfortable enough? Do they feel empowered enough to speak on it in a way that is respectful, but also bold and brave? Are they able to call it out in an age appropriate manner? So, role playing with students so that they have the voice to feel empowered to advocate for themselves in certain situations. And that one is huge because that is a skill that they will continue to develop, that they will take with them for the rest of their lives. Advocacy, teach them that word, teach them what it means to be an advocate for themselves and eventually to be an advocate for others. So, role playing in non threatening situations, making it fun, having your students give voice and come up with scenarios and helping you come up with scenarios that you all can role play at dinner, while driving in the car, to and from practice, whatever activities you all are involved in. Then we have mindfulness practices that can include meditation, yoga, any type of calming activity would be beneficial to help mitigate stress and empower them. Because again, empowering comes from them doing it when they need it, whether you are there or not. Allowing children to help, that's a big one as well. So we talked about that sense of hopelessness earlier. So when students are feeling hopeless, giving them something to do that they feel is impactful, where they feel is helpful to whatever the situation is, whatever inequity that they're being faced with or confronted with, how can they help? Give them the tools that they need, empower them to take action, because sometimes When we're being faced with certain inequities, we want to do something. We want to jump into action. So what does that look like for your student? Again, in a way that is age appropriate, what is it that they can do? Can they write a letter to a local official or a local politician? Would it help for them to participate in some type of volunteer activity? Would it help for them to join some type of youth organization? Think about ways that you can allow your children to help when they are faced with these situations. It empowers them, it gives them purpose, it gives them leadership skills and leadership ability as well. The magic triangle approach. This can be done with anyone, but particularly in this situation, the magic triangle is parent or family, guardian, student, and teacher. So we have that magic triangle approach where you are your child's best advocate, but also teaching your child those advocacy skills and letting your child's teacher know, listen, I'm working with my child on advocating for themselves. We've been doing some role plays. We've been talking about things that they may not feel comfortable with. So I just want to let you know that they have been practicing this at home. And I'm hoping that you are going to be open to that, that you're going to help guide them through that, although I may not be here. So really forming a team through that magic triangle approach where the teacher, the student, and home are all on the same page. Infusing student life with culture. So as we're experiencing certain inequities that are causing the stress in us, we want to feel empowered. And one of the ways to do that is infuse your students' life with their culture. Increasing pride and self-identity is so ever important. And also limiting news media intake, because as adults, that can cause us some stress. That can cause us some anxiety if we're taking in too much of the news media all day, every day. But we can replace it with healthier options. And some of those healthier options might include podcasts that are age appropriate. There are so many that we can also talk about. But replacing that negative news media intake that we experience so much of, replacing it with something that is healthier, that again will help them to express themselves, that will give them different perspectives, and that will empower them to want to try something new. So we'll discuss these strategies further in detail. But what I want you to prepare for is, which of these strategies will you try? Which of these strategies will you implement? Some resources for your reading pleasure. If you need additional resources, please reach out to me and I'll be more than happy to assist you with that. Thank you so much for joining our session today. And I look forward to talking with you further about how to empower our students to mitigate the stress in their lives due to the inequities that they may face. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day.